Local hero or cold-blooded killer. The shocking murder accusation against William Edwards, true crime. Hook. Is the man you trust the most hiding a deadly secret? What happens when a small-town celebrity is accused of cold-blooded murder? You won't believe the twists and betrayals that follow. Stay with us till the end to uncover the shocking truth behind William Edwards' deadly secrets. This true crime case will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. William Edwards was a local hero, a well-known figure in the small town. Everyone knew his name. Everyone smiled when they saw him. The man had charm. He was a star. Until she showed up. Clara Mayfield. A woman with a story. A story that shook the town. She walked into the police station one crisp autumn morning. Her face pale. Eyes wide. A tremble in her voice. She accused him. William Edwards, he killed my brother? The room went still. The chief looked at her like she was mad. You're sure? He asked. She nodded. Slowly. Her fingers twitched. The chief leaned back. Tell me everything. And so she did. It wasn't long ago. Her brother, Mark Mayfield, was found dead. In a dark alley behind the old theater. His throat was slit. No one saw a thing. No witnesses. The only clue was a single red feather. Clara stared at the chief, her voice cracking. William, he left it there. The feather. He had been known for wearing a red feather in his hat. It was his trademark. But no one could believe it. William was a well-respected man. A local celebrity. Everyone loved him. But Clara insisted. And soon, whispers started. People began to question. Could it be true? Could the town's golden boy be hiding a dark side? Clara wasn't done. She had more to say. She told them about a meeting. A conversation she overheard one night. She had gone to the theater. To find Mark. He was supposed to meet her there. But he never showed up. Instead, she heard voices. Low. Threatening. One voice she knew all too well. William's. Her blood ran cold. She didn't stay. She left quickly. But she couldn't shake the image of him. She couldn't forget the way his voice sounded. Mark, you've got to keep quiet, or else. The words echoed in her mind. The town didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to believe it. But Clara couldn't let it go. And neither could she. The haunting thought kept clawing at her. Was William Edwards capable of murder? The truth seemed so far away, yet so close. The days passed in a blur. Whispers grew louder. The town couldn't stop talking. Every corner, every store. People wondered. Could Clara be telling the truth? Could William, the man they trusted, be capable of something so horrific? His smile, that perfect smile, haunted them now. The man who once filled the town with pride, now filled it with dread. The police were cautious. They couldn't just arrest him. There was no hard evidence. No smoking gun. Only a feather. Only words. But the pressure mounted. Clara wouldn't back down. Her brother's death wasn't some accident. It wasn't a random act of violence. She knew what she heard. She knew what she saw. She was determined to get justice. And yet, the more she pushed, the more the town seemed to turn against her. What if she was wrong? What if she was just a woman with a vendetta? Maybe she was the one who had it wrong. But Clara couldn't shake it. The guilt gnawed at her. The fear twisted her insides. She had to know the truth. One evening, she stood outside William's house. The mansion on the hill. It looked different now. Dark. Ominous. A place that had once been welcoming was now suffocating. She breathed in, steadying herself. Then she saw it. A shadow in the window. A movement. Her heart raced. It was him. She could feel it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone. She had to call the police. But something stopped her. A soft sound. A rustle in the bushes beside her. Her eyes snapped to the side. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was him. William Edwards. Standing just feet away. His eyes locked on hers. No smile. No charm. Just cold silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he spoke. Clara, why are you here? The words hung in the air. Like a threat. Clara felt her breath catch. The world seemed to close in around her. The chill in the air became unbearable. Her throat tightened. I need to know the truth, she whispered. His lips curled. But it wasn't a smile. It was something darker. You think you can handle the truth? He asked. The question felt like a weight. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Then, the silence shattered. A loud bang. A car door slamming. The flash of headlights in the distance. A voice calling her name. The moment was gone. William disappeared into the darkness. And Clara stood there, alone. Was he hiding something? Had he just given her a warning? Or had she stepped too far into something she couldn't understand?
She didn't know.
But she was sure of one thing. The truth was closer now than ever before. Clara stood frozen. The air around her was thick, suffocating. The car headlights were now gone. The streets were quiet again. Only the faint hum of the town's night sounds filled the space. Her pulse thundered in her ears. What had just happened? William's words hung like smoke in her mind. You think you can handle the truths? What truth? What was he hiding? She turned and walked slowly back to her car, each step echoing in the silence. The weight of his gaze still pressed on her back. The town seemed to watch her now, too. She could feel the eyes on her as she drove through the empty streets. Everyone was watching. Everyone had been waiting for someone to crack. And now, it felt like it was her turn. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Clara's heart jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. It was short, simple. Meet me at the old theater at midnight. I know who did it. She stared at the message. The words burned into her eyes. Her breath caught. Who could it be? Who would send something like this? Her phone buzzed again, breaking her trance. Another text. Don't tell anyone. You're not safe. Clara's mind raced. Who was on her side? Who could she trust? The old theater had been abandoned for years. It was a relic of the past, forgotten by most. A place that whispered secrets at night. She had to go. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. The road to the theater seemed longer than ever. The streetlights flickered as she passed. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision. The night felt alive with something she couldn't see. And then she arrived. The theater loomed in front of her. Its broken windows stared back like empty eyes. The air was colder here, colder than anywhere else in the town. Clara parked the car, her breath fogging in the night air. She stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Every step felt heavy. The wind whispered through the trees. She approached the theater slowly, cautiously. The door creaked open with a groan. A cold draft hit her face.
Inside, it was pitch black.
But then, a figure stepped out from the shadows.
A man. Tall.
Broad-shouldered. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was William Edwards. But he wasn't alone. Another man stood behind him. A stranger. Clara's pulse quickened. Clara, William's voice was low, almost a growl. I told you to stay away. She stepped back, but the stranger grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron. Let me go, she gasped, pulling away, but he held her tighter. You wanted the truth, William said, his voice suddenly calm. Now you're going to get it. Clara's heart pounded. She tried to break free, but the stranger's hold was unrelenting. William stepped closer, his face twisted in something dark. You should have stayed in your little world, Clara. Now you've gone and ruined everything. The air thickened, the tension rising. Clara couldn't move. She couldn't think. The only thing that mattered was the looming danger. And then she saw it. In William's hand. A knife. Its blade gleamed in the dim light.
Her throat went dry.
Why? She whispered. William's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. Because some people can't be allowed to talk. The stranger leaned in, whispering in her ear. You're not the first to ask questions. But you'll be the last. Clara's stomach dropped. She couldn't breathe. Everything in her screamed to run. But it was too late. The truth she had fought for, was something darker than she ever imagined. Clara sat on the cold, cracked floor of the theater, her legs trembling beneath her. The world felt dizzying, spinning with too much weight, too much horror. Her chest rose and fell erratically as she fought to steady her breath. William Edwards was gone. The officers had him now, cuffed and struggling, pulled away into the night. But Clara felt numb. What she had just learned, what she had uncovered, it was more than just a murder. It was a betrayal of everything she thought she knew about the town, about the man they had all trusted. The sound of her own heartbeat thundered in her ears as she slowly stood up, her knees weak, her body still trembling from the shock. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, dialing the number she had never thought she'd need to call. The chief's voice answered after the first ring. "Clara?" His voice was soft, tired. "Are you okay?" She didn't know how to respond. How could she explain what had just happened? "He's gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "William, he killed Mark?" "I know," the chief replied, his tone grave. "We've got him. He's in custody. We'll make sure he answers for everything." But Clara's mind wasn't listening to the chief. She was still standing in the dark, in the ruins of the theater, with the weight of the truth crushing down on her. She could feel the eyes of the officers still in the room, the unease of the moment hanging thick in the air. "Clara," the chief said again, his voice drawing her back. "We need you to come down to the station."
Now?
She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather herself, to understand the enormity of it all. And then, as if waking from a dream, she nodded, even though she knew no one could see her. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm on my way." The streets were empty as she drove, the headlights of her car slicing through the thick fog that had settled over the town. The trees on either side of the road looked like dark, looming figures, their branches twisting into strange shapes against the night sky. Everything felt wrong. Every corner she turned, every streetlight she passed, felt alien now. She wasn't sure what she would find at the station. She wasn't sure what she would even say. But something had shifted. The town she had grown up in, the town she thought she knew, was no longer what it seemed. The secrets buried beneath its quiet surface were deeper than she could ever have imagined. As she pulled into the station parking lot, her eyes caught a glimpse of the old, weathered sign above the door. Police Department. But now, even that seemed like a lie. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Stepping out of the car, Clara's feet felt heavy, as though she were walking through a nightmare. She could barely feel the cold air against her skin. The door to the station swung open before she reached it. The chief was waiting for her, his face lined with concern. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face as though searching for something. Clara nodded, but it wasn't a full answer. It wasn't even a real one. "Can you tell me everything?" the chief asked quietly, leading her inside. She hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then she began. She told him everything. About the red feather. About the conversation she had overheard in the theater. About the night she had followed Mark into the darkness. About the messages, the threats, and about the moment she had stood face to face with William Edwards. The chief listened quietly, his face unreadable. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he stood up and turned to one of the officers sitting at a desk, writing notes. "Get the files on Edwards. I want everything," the chief ordered. "We're not done here." The officer nodded and left the room. Clara sat there, feeling a strange emptiness inside. It was done. William was caught.
But there were still so many questions.
So many unanswered pieces. The chief walked over to her, his voice gentle. "I need you to know something, Clara," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "What you've uncovered, it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've known for a while that something was off, but we couldn't prove it. Not until now." Clara blinked, trying to process his words. "What do you mean?" she asked. "There's more?" The chief nodded slowly. William Edwards wasn't just some charming local celebrity. He was a player in something much bigger, much darker than anyone could have imagined. And now that we've got him, we're going to make sure the whole truth comes out. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What had she really uncovered? What had she been a part of? The chief's eyes softened. "But you did good, Clara." You saved a lot of people by bringing him down. Clara wasn't sure she felt like a hero. But she did know one thing. This town, the town that had once felt so familiar, would never be the same again. And neither would she. The air inside the police station felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to shift. Clara's mind raced, but her body remained still, frozen in the chair. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to hear the words she'd just heard. William Edwards, a part of something bigger? Her stomach twisted. What could possibly be bigger than what she had already uncovered? The chief's voice broke through her thoughts. We have a lot to go through, Clara. But you need to be prepared. There's more to this than you know. His words hung in the air, thick and foreboding. Clara opened her mouth to ask more, to demand answers, but the chief raised a hand to stop her.
Not yet.
You've already done more than anyone could have asked of you, he said, his tone soft but firm. Right now, you need to rest. There's nothing more you can do tonight. Clara nodded slowly, though her mind was spinning. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving her with a hollow emptiness. The shock was still too fresh. The weight of everything, Mark's death, William's betrayal, pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. The chief gave her a look that was a mixture of sympathy and understanding. I'll have someone drive you home. It's not safe to be alone tonight. Clara didn't argue. She didn't want to be alone, but she didn't want anyone's company either. Still, the chief was right. The world felt like it was slowly shifting beneath her feet. As Clara walked out of the station, the night air hit her like a slap in the face. She hadn't realized how suffocating the police station had felt until she stepped outside. The cold was sharp, biting, but somehow it felt like a small relief compared to the heavy weight inside her chest. The officer who'd been assigned to take her home stood by his car, waiting. His eyes were kind, though there was something tense in his stance. He was probably just as overwhelmed by the events of the night as she was. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that made Clara feel like a stranger in her own life. The officer didn't speak, and neither did she. The hum of the engine and the occasional swoosh of passing headlights were the only sounds. When they reached her house, Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she should thank him, or if she even had the strength to do so. He stopped the car, and for a moment, there was just the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled. Take care of yourself, Clara, the officer said quietly, his voice soft with a kind of weary caution. If you need anything, just call. She nodded without a word, her hands gripped tightly around the door handle as if the simple act of getting out would anchor her to something solid. She walked slowly to her front door, her footsteps echoing in the empty, dark street. The porch light flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows over the yard. Everything felt wrong. As she stepped inside, the house was still. Too still. The silence wrapped around her like a thick fog, and for a moment, Clara just stood there, unsure of what to do next. She couldn't bring herself to turn on the lights. The soft glow of the street lamp outside was enough for her to make her way to the kitchen. She needed water. She needed something to settle her racing mind. Her hand hovered over the sink, the cool metal faucet gleaming under the dim light. She gripped it, but the noise of the water hitting the glass was somehow too loud. She felt like she could hear every drop as it splashed. Suddenly, she was aware of her reflection in the kitchen window, her pale face staring back at her, wide-eyed, unsettled. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same person who had left the house this morning. She looked different.
Changed.
The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a sharp sound in the quiet, startling in its abruptness. Clara's heart jumped. Who could it be at this hour? She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then, instinctively, she walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. Standing there, in the shadow of the porch light, was someone she hadn't expected to see. Someone she had hoped never to see again. It was Clara's father. His face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He looked worn, beaten by time and guilt. "Clara," he said softly, his voice broken. "I need to talk to you." Her stomach churned.
No.
Not tonight.
Not now.
Dad. I don't, she started, her words catching in her throat. But he stepped forward, his gaze urgent, desperate. Please. It's important, he insisted, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's mind was too clouded to think clearly. But there was something in his eyes, something that made her step aside, letting him into the house without thinking. He didn't say a word as he stepped past her, his heavy boots leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. He walked into the living room and sank down onto the couch, his hands shaking as he rested them on his knees. Clara stood there, unsure of what to do. She closed the door slowly, the click echoing like a final seal. Why are you here, Dad? She finally asked, her voice flat. Her body still felt as if it were wrapped in the shock of everything that had happened tonight. Her father took a long breath, exhaling slowly. His eyes seemed to shift, avoiding hers. I know everything, he said finally. About William. About Mark. About the drugs. Clara's stomach dropped. How? She whispered, feeling a sharp pang of dread twist through her. Her father's eyes met hers then, and for the first time in years, Clara saw something raw in his gaze.
Fear.
Regret. And maybe guilt. He lowered his voice even further, as though the walls might be listening. Because I was involved. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her father's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves had closed in around her. She didn't know how to breathe. Didn't know what to say. You were involved, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Her father nodded slowly, his eyes avoiding hers. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together in his lap. I didn't want you to find out this way, he said, his voice raw with something Clara couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Or fear. Maybe both. Her chest tightened. She took a step back, trying to process it, trying to understand. How could you be involved in something like this? With William? With that kind of business? She asked, the words barely making it past the lump in her throat. Her father's face twisted in pain. His gaze flickered, then settled on the floor. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he muttered. It was supposed to be easy. Quiet. We were supposed to stay out of the dangerous part of it. But I got in over my head, Clara. Clara shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. You're telling me that you've been part of whatever William was into. Drugs? The whole thing with Mark. Her father closed his eyes for a moment, his face contorting as if he were bracing for a blow.
Yes.
Yes, Clara. I got involved when I was younger. It was never supposed to go this far. It was supposed to be just a small thing, something to keep the business going, to keep us afloat. His voice cracked, and Clara couldn't hold the anger back anymore. Her mind screamed. Her fists clenched at her sides. You let this go on? You let him get away with it, she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. You let people die. Her father winced, but didn't look up. I tried to stay out of it as much as I could. But William, he had a way of pulling people in.
People like me.
People who thought they could control it, thought they could manage the fallout. But they couldn't. None of us could. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And Mark got too close. He knew too much. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The words, the cold truth, crashed down on her like a wave. You let him die. You let your own son's death happen. Her father's face twisted with pain and shame. I tried to warn him. I begged him to stay away. But Mark, he thought he could take them down. He thought he could be a hero. But he wasn't ready for what was behind that curtain, Clara. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she held them back, her fists still clenched, her chest aching with the weight of everything she was learning. And you didn't do anything? You didn't try to stop it, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her father's gaze shifted to the floor again, his eyes hollow. I couldn't. It wasn't just William. There were other people involved. Bigger names. More powerful names. People who could disappear you if you crossed them. His voice was barely audible now, a broken whisper of a man who'd lost his way. Clara's mind reeled. Her father, her flesh and blood, was as entangled in this web of lies and crime as William had been. Worse, he had let it happen. He had chosen silence over truth, selfishly preserving his own safety, and in doing so, had allowed Mark to be slaughtered in the streets. But you could have done something. You could have stopped it, Clara said, the words sharp, the anger still pulsing in her veins. Her father's face contorted with guilt, his fists tightening in his lap. I know. I should have. But I couldn't. I couldn't do anything without putting you in danger. Too. You wouldn't have understood, not back then. And he cut himself off, a deep breath escaping his lips. You've lied to me, Clara said flatly, the words like a slap. My whole life, you've lied to me. Her father didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he lowered his head, as if the weight of his actions had crushed him to the floor. I never wanted this for you. Never. His voice was thick with regret. But by the time I realized what we were all really tangled in, it was too late. Clara didn't know what to feel. The father she'd once looked up to, the man she'd trusted, had betrayed her. Not just her, but everything he had ever taught her about right and wrong. About the importance of honesty. About loyalty. And now, he was standing in front of her, broken, a shell of the man she had once known. She couldn't bring herself to forgive him. Not yet. Maybe never. Where's William now? Clara asked, her voice steady, though her insides were twisting with disgust. He's in custody, her father said, his voice quieter. But there are other people involved. People who'll do anything to keep this quiet. To keep the truth buried. Clara's blood ran cold. You're telling me there are more people? Her father nodded grimly. Much bigger names. And they won't stop with William. They'll come after anyone who gets in their way. Including you. The words felt like a punch. Clara's head spun as her father's warning sank in. She had already uncovered more than she ever wanted to know. But now, it seemed like the darkest part of the truth was still hidden somewhere, waiting for her to uncover it. Why are you telling me this now? Clara asked, her voice thin and hollow. Her father met her eyes, a mixture of sorrow and fear in his gaze. Because I'm trying to protect you. I can't change what's happened. I can't bring Mark back. But I can warn you. Clara's mind was a whirlwind. Her father's confession only deepened the mess of lies, the tangled web that had already consumed everything she knew. Protect me? She asked, her voice rising in disbelief. By hiding the truth? By keeping me in the dark all these years? Her father stood up suddenly, his hands shaking as he placed them on her shoulders. Clara, listen to me. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I'm not trying to protect myself. I'm trying to protect you, the people you're going after. They won't stop until they silence everyone involved. They will do anything to make sure their secrets stay buried. Clara stared at her father, his grip tight on her shoulders. She wasn't sure if it was fear or guilt in his eyes, but the warning was clear. She had no idea what she was truly up against. She had no idea how deep the shadows ran. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could survive in a world where everything she thought was real, everything she believed, had been built on lies. But there was one thing she was certain of now. The fight wasn't over. And the truth, no matter how dangerous, was coming for her. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, her body tense beneath her father's grip. His words echoed in her mind like a warning bell, but she couldn't make sense of them. The shadows were deeper now, the fear thicker. Protect me, she repeated, her voice edged with disbelief. From what? From who? Her father's eyes flickered with panic. You don't understand, Clara, he said urgently, his hands shaking. I didn't just get involved with William. I've made enemies. And these aren't people you can run from. These aren't the kinds of people who forget. Clara pulled away from him, her hand shaking as she crossed her arms over her chest. Her father's sudden desperation sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't the man she had known. This was a stranger, a man who had hidden so much, a man who had kept his family in the dark for far too long. She backed away slowly, her pulse racing. You've been lying to me my whole life, she said, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. You've been part of this world, the world that killed Mark. And now you want me to believe that you're trying to protect me? Her father's face twisted with something that looked like regret, but Clara couldn't find it in herself to feel sympathy. Not anymore. Not after everything he had kept hidden. "I never wanted you to be a part of this," he whispered.
You were supposed to have a better life than this.
"But I was wrong. I was weak." Clara's chest tightened, her mind struggling to process the betrayal, the years of silence, of complicity. "But you are a part of it," she said sharply. "And now I'm a part of it too." Her father's face fell as if her words had struck him harder than any punch could. "Clara, But she didn't want to hear it.
Not now.
She couldn't. She had spent too long living in the dark. The truth was ugly, and it was too much for her to bear in one night. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, feeling the weight of everything pushing her down. "Clara, please," her father's voice cracked, pleading behind her. "You need to listen to me. You need to get out of town. They're coming for you. I'm not asking this as a father. I'm telling you, as someone who knows how this works." Her hand hovered on the door handle. She stood there for a long moment, torn between the man who had raised her and the man who had betrayed her trust, who had allowed everything to happen. "What do you mean? They're coming for me?" she asked, her voice tight, her throat dry. He stepped forward, but Clara quickly spun around, holding up a hand to stop him. "Don't come any closer." Her father's eyes flickered with desperation. "Clara, listen to me. You're too close to the truth. You're in danger, more than you realize. The people involved in this, William's business, they won't stop. And now they know you're looking for answers. If they think you're going to expose them..." His voice trailed off, and Clara could almost hear the unspoken threat in the silence. She wasn't sure if he was trying to protect her or if he was simply trying to save his own skin, but it didn't matter. She couldn't trust him, and she didn't trust herself anymore, either. "I'm not leaving," Clara said, her voice cold. "I'm not running from this." Her father's face twisted, his lips trembling with a mix of fear and anger.
You don't have a choice.
"This isn't some game, Clara. You think you can handle this? You think you can take down people like them? They'll bury you in a second. They'll make you disappear without a trace." Clara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, a sickening realization settling over her. She had thought that by finding the truth, by uncovering William's lies, she would have answers, closure. But now, it felt like opening a door to a world she wasn't prepared for. A world that would consume her if she wasn't careful. "I'm not scared of them," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. Her father's eyes narrowed.
You should be.
The words hung in the air like a curse. Clara stood there for a moment, her thoughts racing, her hands trembling. She had to do something. She couldn't just let this go. But she also couldn't deny the danger. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. "I'll be fine," Clara said, her voice distant. "I'm stronger than you think." Her father stared at her, a deep sadness in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something else, but then stopped, his lips pressed tightly together. There was nothing more to say. Clara felt the tension between them like a wall, cold and impenetrable. She had to leave. Her father's gaze followed her as she walked to the door, but she didn't look back. As she stepped into the night, the cool air bit at her skin. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The houses stood in the distance, shadows stretching long across the sidewalks. Clara could feel the weight of her decision, the uncertain path she had just stepped onto. She couldn't go back. Not now. She had come this far. But what was waiting for her next? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much darker. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. As she walked toward her car, her hand hovered over the door handle. And just as she was about to open it, she froze. A dark figure stood in the shadows across the street, watching her. Clara's pulse quickened. She knew, in that instant, that the game was far from over. And the people who were hunting her weren't done yet. She wasn't safe. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The figure across the street hadn't moved, but she could feel its presence, like a shadow stretching just a little too far into the night. Her body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get in the car and drive as fast as she could, but she didn't. Not yet. The figure didn't move, but its gaze, she could feel it, was fixed on her.
It wasn't a random passerby.
This was deliberate. This person, whoever they were, had been waiting for her, watching her. Clara's heart raced, pounding against her ribcage like it was trying to escape. She took a careful step backward, feeling the cool metal of her car against her fingertips. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. Asterisk, they'll come after you. They'll make you disappear, asterisk. The words repeated in her head, each one like a cold dagger sinking deeper into her gut. She couldn't just stand here. She had to make a move. Slowly, she slid into the driver's seat, her fingers trembling as she gripped the wheel. Her eyes never left the shadow across the street. The figure hadn't taken a single step, but its presence felt like an invisible force closing in on her. She turned the key, the engine roaring to life, but her foot remained frozen over the brake. The world outside felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. The figure was still there. And then, just as she was about to shift the car into drive, the figure moved. It was a small motion at first, a flicker of movement, but it was enough to make her pulse spike. The figure didn't approach her car.
No.
Instead, it turned its back to her and started walking down the street, slowly and deliberately, as if it knew she would follow. Clara's stomach twisted. Was it a warning? A challenge? Her breath came out in a shallow gasp as she weighed her options. She could drive away, go home, lock herself in the house, pretend that nothing had changed. Pretend that everything wasn't falling apart around her. But the truth was she couldn't. Not anymore. She had come this far. There was no going back. Her foot slammed onto the accelerator, and she sped forward, her headlights cutting through the darkness, chasing the shadow that had led her this far. The figure was walking quickly now, but not running. Almost like it was waiting for her to catch up, daring her to follow. Clara's pulse quickened as she drove after it, weaving through the quiet, empty streets. Her eyes flicked from the road to the figure in front of her. It was tall, moving with purpose, but the way it moved, calm, collected, confident, it wasn't like anyone she had seen before. This wasn't some random person. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone connected to William? Someone tied to the web of lies and crime her father had been tangled in for years? Or was it something else? Someone sent specifically for her? The figure turned down a narrow side street, a part of town she didn't recognize. The buildings were run down, the streets poorly lit, and there was a lingering smell of decay in the air. It looked like a place where the forgotten came to disappear. Clara hesitated. It was too late to back down now. She had come too far. She pulled the car to the side of the street and parked, keeping the headlights on. Her hands were sweating against the steering wheel, her eyes darting nervously between the rearview mirror and the street ahead. The figure was nowhere to be seen. She had lost them.
Or had they wanted her to?
The unsettling thought made her stomach churn. Clara's fingers gripped the door handle, ready to get out. But just as she was about to open it, a voice shattered the silence. "Don't get out of the car." Clara froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, cutting through the night like a knife. It was cold, detached, familiar, yet not. Clara's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. A man, dressed in dark clothes, was standing behind her car, his hands in his pockets, his face hidden beneath a hood. The voice hadn't come from him, though. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere closer. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned her head slowly to the passenger seat. A second figure had slipped into the car without her noticing. A man, his features sharp, his eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't wearing a mask, but the darkness in his eyes made him seem like he was hiding something far worse than his face. "I said don't get out of the car," he repeated, his voice smooth, but with an edge to it that sent a shiver crawling down her spine. Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. Her thoughts were racing, but nothing made sense. How had he gotten inside the car? She hadn't heard anything, no door opening, no footsteps.
He was too calm.
Too sure of himself. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling despite her best effort to keep it steady. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in the seat, his eyes never leaving hers. It was like he was studying her, taking his time, savoring her fear. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You're in deeper than you think. You're not just a bystander, Clara. You're part of this now." Her heart skipped a beat. "Part of this? What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice stronger now, though her hands were still trembling. The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "You were always part of it. You just didn't know it. But now that you've started asking questions, now that you've stepped into this, there's no going back." Clara's head spun. "No going back? Who sent you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth was creeping into her veins, thick and poisonous. She could feel it now, the way the world had shifted under her feet. This wasn't just about her father anymore. It wasn't even just about William. It was bigger. Far bigger. The man leaned in closer, his breath cold against her ear. "You'll find out soon enough. But for now, stay in your car.
Keep driving.
Don't stop. Don't turn back." Clara's pulse raced as the car door behind her opened and closed with a soft click. The figure outside had moved again. She was trapped. The voice in her ear was the only thing that anchored her to reality. "If you want to survive, Clara," the man whispered, his words sending a chill down her spine, "you have to keep moving." Clara's breath hitched as the man's words echoed in her mind. "You have to keep moving." She could hear his voice, cold and commanding, reverberating in her ears, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surging through her body. She was frozen for a moment, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. Every instinct told her to flee, to drive away as fast as she could. But the figure outside was still there, waiting, watching. She had no choice. Clara slammed the car into gear, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. The engine roared to life, and the tires screeched as she shot forward, the headlights slicing through the darkened streets like knives. The man in the passenger seat didn't speak again, but Clara could feel his presence like a weight pressing against her, suffocating her with each passing second. The streets were unfamiliar now, the buildings thinning out, the roads winding into desolate corners of the city she had never seen before. The air felt thick, suffocating with an unseen tension, as if the city itself were holding its breath. She glanced at the rearview mirror, nothing. The figure had disappeared. Clara's grip on the wheel tightened. Her pulse raced faster. Where were they taking her? The man beside her didn't speak, but his silence was more terrifying than any words. She sped through the empty streets, the shadows stretching long across the cracked pavement. The city's heart was beating slower now, as if she had driven far enough from the places she knew, into the underbelly of it all. The feeling of being watched didn't leave her, though. It was a constant, gnawing pressure against her chest. And then, without warning, the car pulled up to a dead end. A dark, towering building loomed ahead, its windows blacked out, its structure a massive, silent monolith. Clara didn't stop, though. She kept her foot on the gas, the engine growling as she sped toward the brick wall in front of her. At the last moment, the man beside her spoke again. "Get out." Clara slammed the brakes, but her foot didn't leave the pedal. She was trapped by her choices, by her curiosity, by the people she had unknowingly angered. The car jerked to a halt just inches from the wall. The man didn't move. His cold eyes bored into her, unblinking. "Now," he said again, his voice ice. Clara knew there was no going back. She opened the door and stepped out into the heavy silence. The air felt thick, oppressive. And then she heard it, a low hum coming from the building ahead, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath her feet. Something shifted behind her. A door creaked open, and the air grew colder, darker. She didn't look back. She had already come this far. The truth, whatever it was waiting. And there was no escaping it now. Clara walked toward the looming darkness, feeling the weight of every step. The door ahead opened wider, as if inviting her into the depths of the unknown. She wasn't sure if she was walking toward the truth or walking into her own grave. But she was moving, and there was no turning back. Clara stepped forward, her heart beating loudly in her chest, the sound of her pulse drowning out everything else. The door to the building loomed in front of her, heavy and imposing, as if it were an entryway to a world she could never return from. Her mind raced, but the steady rhythm of her breath was all she could hear now. She glanced back one last time at the car, the man still watching from the passenger seat. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of satisfaction, or perhaps anticipation. It unsettled her more than she could express. With a final breath, Clara stepped into the darkness. The door creaked open with an eerie, almost deliberate slowness. As she crossed the threshold, she felt the temperature drop, and the faint hum of the building seemed to pulse around her. The silence was thick, suffocating, like the air was charged with something she couldn't quite place. Inside, the dim lighting revealed a narrow hallway, its walls lined with old photographs, dusty bookshelves, and remnants of a time long past. The floor beneath her feet creaked with every step, the sound echoing in the stillness. She hesitated. Was this the end? Was she about to walk into the belly of the beast? Before she could gather her thoughts, a voice echoed down the hallway. It was soft, almost gentle, but its power was undeniable. Clara. She stopped in her tracks, her body frozen in place. The voice didn't come from anywhere she could see, yet it felt as though it came from all around her. We've been waiting for you. The weight of the words settled on her like a heavy cloak, suffocating her, yet forcing her to move forward. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but this quiet, unseen menace was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. She followed the voice, step by step, drawn like a moth to the flame. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway. A large wooden door stood before her, its surface worn with age. Without thinking, she pushed it open. Inside was a room filled with shadows. There were no windows, just a single desk bathed in a dim light. Behind it sat a figure, familiar, yet unrecognizable. The man who had once been her father's closest friend. The man who had disappeared years ago. "You've come far, Clara," he said, his voice like gravel. "But you don't know what you're really up against." Clara's breath caught. Everything she had believed, every assumption she had made, was starting to crumble. This wasn't just about William Edwards. This wasn't just about murder. It was a web of deceit, a puzzle she had only begun to understand. The figure behind the desk smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Now let's see how far you're willing to go." As the shadows in the room grew deeper, Clara felt the weight of her decisions crushing down on her. There was no going back. She had stepped into the darkness, and now she was trapped in it. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Clara knew, with an icy certainty, that this was just the beginning. The truth she had been seeking was far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. And now, there was no way out.